Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to take a look at Richard III. This is the War of the Roses. Another great game by Columbia Games. And so what we'll do is kind of go through the game turns, take a look at how it's played, and just give you some of my thoughts, my opinions. So first thing I want to share though is this was a copy provided by Columbia Games, so I could do reviews and unboxings. So thank you for that, and I hope you enjoy what we have. I'm going to actually move the camera down here so you can take a look at the map and some blocks, and then we'll start taking a look at some game components. Alright, so here's a couple of blocks and then a little shot of the map. The map, again, I think has fantastic work when I compare it to the other games that they have. And the blocks are also really good. We'll take a look at some of the specifics of game components as we move forward, but just to kind of give you a quick little run over here of the map. And the blocks are set in the starting position, and just for setup there, I know, kind of panning fast, but I want to talk about the game a little bit. So the game, you got your two factions. There's York, which are the white blocks, and Lancaster, which are the red blocks. The way the game is you're trying to vie ultimately for who's going to be king. And so the Lancaster, they start the game as king, and then the York blocks, they start as the pretender. And the game, when you play it then, is going to have three campaigns. Each campaign has 7 game turns, and so the 7 game turns are where you do your main actions, moving things, and there's 4 different actions that you have. So there's like your moving phase, there's a recruit phase, after the moving and recruiting is done, then there's a battle phase, and then there's a supply phase. So we'll take a look at the different phases and what they mean. But how do we start things off? Well, first thing you're going to do is you have a deck of cards. There's 19 action cards, and then there's let's see, 6 event cards. So the event cards are going to be labeled here with an event like surprise, and then it's going to say what happens for that event. And then you also have your action card, which is going to be used to determine your initiative, and also used to let you know how many units you get to move that particular turn, or recruit, or it's just action points essentially. So what you would do then is you're going to deal each player 7 cards, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now there's a rule in here, it's like a mulligan rule, where if you happen to have less than 13 points, like action points, so you just total up real quick, you could then shuffle these back into the deck and then draw 7 more, so that you have more than 13 action points, because your opponent could get very lucky and have a lot of action points, and then they would win initiative often, and then you wouldn't win initiative, plus then you wouldn't have many action points to activate or recruit troops or things like that. Alright, so after you deal your 7 cards and you're ready to start your game, which is great, because again, if you're trying to memorize the 7 steps, this is how you keep track of that. The more cards you play and you have like 6 cards left, okay, I got 6 turns left. And that's important for me, because when I play solo, a lot of times I kind of forget where I'm at. So unless I write it down or take notes, but the cards do a great job in reminding me that, oh, okay, I've got 4 turns left in this campaign. Alright, so what we'll do then is kind of go forward, talk about some of the different steps. So I've got my 7 cards, so what do we do with that? So the first thing we would do after we have our cards and we know there's no mulligan and I've got everything that I need, I'm going to then, as the player, decide which card I want to play to start off that particular turn. And then you and your opponent then are going to lay down a card face down. Alright, so let's say I've got, this is the York player, then here's the Lancaster. So you flip and you just compare. So higher number goes. Ties go to the pretender. Now, if you play an event card, then the person with the event card wins initiative. However, if both players play an event card, then, let me see if I got one here. I would have to dig through to find one real quick. But if you both play an event card, then the tie, well, if they were tied, I don't have another event card with a 1. But anyway, if you both play an event card, then again the person with the higher number would go. But if you had an event card where they were both, say, a 1, let me grab one. I'm a visual person, so I like to see. Boom. But if we both played an event card that had a 1, then the tie would still go to the pretender. Alright, so then once you have gotten your card and you've determined who's going to go first, then it's going to break down into the phases. And so we'll go ahead and start looking at some of the gameplay aspects. Now, one thing the rules do say, though, that is if you play the card and you win, you don't actually have to do anything. So it says you can play a card, but you can do nothing if you desire. It's just that you can't save action points, and that's the important thing. So even though I play down a 4, for example, and decide not to do anything this game turn, I can't save that up and then apply it towards a future game turn. So if you're going to play a 4, that usually means you're going to do something with it. Otherwise, it's just kind of a waste of a lot of action points. So to do a lot of these actions, like the moving and combat's going to take place on the map. And the map is divided into these different areas, and the areas also are represented by the major houses. And this is actually a very cool, this is why I really wanted to get into some historical gaming, is I never really considered before just exactly how complicated the political layout was of like England back in the 15th century. So I think it's just very cool to see all the different houses and back then, just in my mind I'm imagining, because this was probably a rather large piece of land to walk across. It's almost like every city was its own little political body that then reported to a larger political body. So it's just really neat to see that, all the houses that are spread out. And so that's what you see. Now the areas can either be friendly, which means it's owned by someone. So, since I've got this area where it's got a Lancaster unit in Wilts, then Wilts is going to be a friendly to Lancaster. You can also have where it's enemy controlled. So for example, with the starting layout, we actually had to move units across from Calais out to Kent or onto the main map, or from Ireland onto the main map. But if I had Kent here, for example, which would be under York control, then this would be enemy occupied for Lancaster but friendly for York. Then you're also going to have vacant areas which don't contain anybody, and then also contested. So if both people here were in Sussex ready to fight, then that would be a contested area. Now the shields are also important to talk about. I put him back in Calais. As you can see then where the major houses are, that's important because when you have a noble in an area matching his shield, he actually gets a combat bonus when he's defending. Now we also have, when you have heirs to the king and they're fighting over an area that has a crown and say a shield, corresponding shield and the crown symbol, there's a possibility then that person gets to add 1 for the defense of having their matching shield, and then you're going to have a bonus for also being an heir and being on a crown spot. Alright, so the map is pretty important then as far as maybe what areas you want to control. So just for example, we have here 2 heirs, and they're in their matching shield and they have a crown. So the senior heir would get the bonus of the crown. So if you have 2 heirs in a spot, only one gets the bonus. And the senior one is the lower number. So basically this number down here in the corner kind of represents how far down the line of succession they are. So the king player and the heirs get the bonus. So it wouldn't be like if York had an heir there, if he's not the king at the time, he's not going to get the bonus either. So this would be an example of matching shield and crown. So that would give a firepower bonus of 2 when defending the crown, essentially. Also on the map are 7 rather large cities. There's 4 cities that favor the Lancasters and 3 cities that favor York. And so just kind of like defending a shield or a crown, you can actually hire a levy. Each city will have a levy that you could get, and then they would also get a defensive bonus. So if you need to recruit and defend an area, that would be a great way to do that. Just recruit somebody and they're defended. We also have 2 cathedrals. Let me go ahead and find one of them on the map for you. So here's an example of the church blocks. As you can see, there's Canterbury and York, and then each is going to have a color for York and for the Lancasters, but it works the same way. If you have a church block in the cathedral, they'll get a +1 to their firepower when defending. Alright, then we have a special place over here. This is Wales. Wales is actually made up of these 4 areas. There's Caernarfon, Pembroke, Powys, and Glamorgan. So apologize for the pronunciations. But the Welsh block is going to be able to, in any one of those 4 areas, get their +1 bonus to firepower when defending. Now Wales is open to any player to go in. It's not an exile area, but there are a couple exile areas on the map. So for Lancaster, France and Scotland are the exile areas, and then for York it's Ireland and then Calais down at the opposite end of the map. Now with the exile areas, the enemy can never enter or attack in. Those are kind of off limits to the opposing player. That's just for your side. Now, as far as Scotland and Ireland go, the Irish, because they're Ireland, it's over here, they actually have to travel by way of the Irish Sea. So they have to do a sea move to get anywhere. But Scotland, because that's opened up by land, then you can like retreat into it and things like that because it's all connected by land. So those are the special things about the 2 exile areas. Alright, also on the map you've got 3 sea areas. So there's the English Channel, the North Sea up here, and then you also have the Irish Sea, and they're separated by these dashed lines. What's interesting is if you say needed to deploy amphibious, but like a sea move, for example, Cornwall could deploy things to either the Irish Sea or to the English Channel because he borders both of those seas. Also on the map, you've got 3 islands. There's the Isle of Wight, and then right up here is the Isle of Ainsley, and then finally the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man, that's the only island that you can play, and that's because it's got a shield. And so to get there, you would have to use a sea movement to take it. Alright, another thing about the map is all of the coastal areas have ports, and then you also have some major ports, and the ports are going to help you and aid in movement as far as the sea movements go. And then we'll take a look at that as we get to that part later. And we'll just do a quick rundown of the blocks. There's several block types. So these are the heirs. Well, you'll know they'll be designated by this little king symbol right there, the crown. And again, they have this number which tells you which where in line of succession they are. So a lower number would be the more senior. 5 would be like the minor, that's the youngest child. Now with each block, even though this is the like the heir block or king block, this is your noble block, this is one of the church blocks with the cross on it. This is a levy. So far all the levies I've seen, they've got the crossed pole arms there, so those are the like the town guard militia, and then the rebels which York can recruit. Now even though there's different types of blocks, they have a lot of similar parts to them. So for example, they have a strength. This is 3 strength, 4 strength, 3, 4, 4, right? How many diamonds they have. That equates to how many dice you roll in combat. Then as you take damage, you rotate the block to indicate how much strength it has left, and then 1, and then finally after it loses that last diamond, it's eliminated. Now you also have over here in the upper right this B2, you have like a C1. That's the firepower. That's the number you need to roll on that die when you do combat. So if I've got my heir there, Richmond, at 3 diamonds and I roll 3 dice, then I'd have to roll a 2 or a 1 to inflict a point of damage. Now you also have the letter. The letter designates their initiative. So all of the A's would go first. So for example, rebels are an A. Then all of the B's would go, and then all of the C's would go, and then it would be, you know, defenders and then attackers. So that's your initiative and their firepower. You also have the name and like their home territory. Tudor, I can't pronounce that. Stafford, had to read it, they're real small. But that's some of the basics of the blocks. There's also some mercenary units, which you have, like Lancaster gets the French, Scots, and the Welsh, for example. Those would be other blocks they could purchase. One other number here on the noble block that's important is this number here. That's their defect numbers. There's a chance in combat, if you have like one of the heirs, there's a chance that you can, and there's one other unit too we'll talk about, but there's a chance that you can use one of your actions to get one of these nobles to defect. And so what it says is that number, you would roll that many dice, and if you get even numbers on all the dice, then that block will defect. So a 1, it seems like that'd be pretty easy for the other player to, you know, defect or cause them to leave. They must be unhappy. Whereas a 2 is a little tougher, so I'd have to get even numbers on 2 dice. And generally, I think 2 is probably the highest 3. Who's that? Warwick. He's got 3. Oh, that means he's very loyal. Very loyal. I'd have to roll even numbers on all 3 to get defect. And we'll probably cover defection again when we get there, but you will see that some of the blocks, once they defect, they'll have a different defection number. So it's either easier or more difficult for them to get to turn, depending on which faction they belong to. Alright, so when the actions are going, basically what you do first is like all the movement, right? So if you're playing, so let's say I'm playing an action card here, and I'm playing the number 4. What that means is I get to activate 4 areas for movement. So for example here, I've got this area which has got some Lancaster units, and I set up this area here which got some York units. What I would do is, if I was playing this and I lay my 4 down, I'm going to activate this area first for 1 action point of my 4. And I can either then move all these blocks together, or I can move 1 block here, 1 block here, you know, or leave 1 block. But that's what 1 action point does, is it activates that entire area, and then you can move as many blocks as you want. Now blocks can actually move to a second adjacent area if you wanted. But there are some rules for limits. So for example, if you've got a yellow border, let me just shift this. I chose this area of the map because it's got all the colors right here. So if there's a yellow border, you can actually move up to 4 blocks across a yellow border. And then they could move on to another border. But if you have a blue border, only 3 blocks can cross. So if I moved all of these here, then because they could technically move to a second area, if I wanted to go to Hereford, for example, or up here to fight, I would actually only be able to move 3 blocks because that's a blue border. So I can move 3 blocks up, and then they would be able to fight. Now you have also this red border. Red border, just from the way the map depiction looks, that's probably very mountainous. So if I had my 4 blocks back here, red block, you can cross 2, but then they have to stop. Now, if I didn't have my enemy blocks there, I can move them here. So even though normally you can move up to 2 areas, once you cross a red border, you have to stop. And I think that's probably because it's very tough terrain. Now, if let's say I did this move here. If I moved 1 block into an area with enemy units, there's this thing called pinning. And what that means is one attacking block would pin a defender, and the defender gets to decide which block is pinned. So for example, let's say I've got Warwick here, your opponent might say, well, I'm going to leave Kent open because I can now leave. So basically each attacker gets to pin 1 defender. Now if I, let's say, did that cool thing where I move 4 blocks, well, let's leave 1 behind because we want to defend. So if I take my 3 blocks here and then I move 1, all 3 up here, technically those blocks there would be pinned, right? They're stuck. They couldn't move. So that might be a strategy. If you want to make sure you fight everybody, bring enough blocks to pin. But then, also that looks very crowded. But you got to remember, you're going to be moving your blocks and everything standing up. All right, so that's the basics of land movement. All right, so for sea movement, it's not that complicated either. Essentially what it is you can move from one area on a sea to anywhere else in the same area by sea. So for example, I could move a unit from Cornwall and do, for one action point, move them over here to Sussex. I guess technically you could kind of go like from Dorset. Well, it doesn't look like there's a, I guess that's a blue border right there. I mean, I guess you could do a land movement, but I get, if I had a York player in between, I couldn't travel by land, so I could go by sea around. Now there is a rule where the heavy ports, this is where the heavy or the major ports come in. You can move 2 blocks for an action point by a heavy port, and then they have to go, I keep calling it heavy port, they have to go to a major port over here, but they have to stop at the same major port. So unlike land movement, you can't move them to different major ports. They have to stick together. So for 1 AP, you could move 2 units by port. Now, with the sea as well, you got to be careful because you couldn't say move by sea from Dorset, for example, and just claim a sea move all the way up to Glamorgan, because they're actually technically in 2 different sea zones. So there's the English Channel, and then that would be the Irish Sea up here. But if I was in Cornwall, well, I could do that because Cornwall actually is attached to both. And that would be an example of Kent. You could do that because it touches both. Now, there's also some of the exile areas, like for example from Calais, you have to do a sea move to get off of Calais onto the mainland. And since there's not a major port attached to, oh yeah, there's a major port. So you can start by moving 2 blocks from Calais out to, say, Kent. Or because Calais borders 2 seas, you might be able to find another major port to go to. Just a little tough for York because they got to cross the ocean to get started there. Now there are a couple folks that don't sea move. Levies who defend a city, they don't sea move. Church units don't sea move. And then it also has the Scots and the Welsh. They won't sea move either. They kind of like where they're at. All right, so that's the basics of movement. We'll take a look at what it takes to recruit. Oh, and just to add another thought to the movement too, one thing is if you do move by sea, then you can't also move by land. So you get 1 movement. And then you can't retreat by sea either. That's why Ireland would be kind of tough to go from and then get pushed back, because you can't retreat to Ireland unless you have a piracy card, which would then let you retreat by sea. All right, so that's the last couple thoughts on movement. Alright, so with recruiting, if you spend an action point, you can buy a block. So for example, if I was going to buy this noble, if he didn't start on the map, right, I was going to buy this noble unit, I would then deploy him to a friendly or vacant area with that matching shield. So for example, I would be able to deploy him down in Cornwall because it was friendly. Now, if they had enemy player there, I wouldn't be able to deploy him in that area. And that's the only area on the map where that shield. But as you can see, there's actually a few areas that have the same shield in a different spot. So for example, in East Anglia, there's this shield. So if there was a York player here, I could still deploy that shield, say, over here in Caernarvon or down here in Glamorgan. So you just have to make sure you match up the shield. Also, your cathedrals, if the area is friendly or vacant, you could deploy a church unit in one of the cathedrals, York or Canterbury. And then also the levy units, like, so for example, if I bought, well, we had earlier, I think a Coventry, forget which one of the we had earlier, but anyway, you'd have Coventry. If that was the levy, he could deploy there. If that was under friendly control, like here's a levy for York, for example, I could play that as long as York was friendly or vacant, which is right up here. All right. Also, when you recruit somebody, they come in at full strength, so you don't have to buy them at their weakest level and build them up. They come in at full strength, which is great. There's also a few mercenary units that you can recruit for each side. They can deploy anywhere on the map that's friendly or vacant, for example, but they can't, well, actually, they deploy in the exile area and then come out. Yeah, so mercenaries start in the exile location and then they come out. I was thinking the Bombard. Bombard, if you buy that, that can go to any friendly city Oh, Rebel, that's what I was thinking of. So the Rebel unit, which is the black block. If you buy the Rebels, they can come out into any area that is friendly or vacant. Mercenaries deploy in the exile area and come onto the map with you, and then a bombard deploys to a friendly city. The other thing too about recruiting is you cannot buy back strength throughout the campaign. So if my rebels get dropped down to, say, the 2-step strength, they recruit at 4, but if I take damage throughout the campaign, I can't replenish that during the campaign, which is why it's important to keep track of, say, where you can retreat. Like, for example, when we talked about pinning, I don't think I covered this. If I was to say, only pin one of these blocks, and this guy was maybe down to 1 strength point, and I didn't want him to die, well, I could have him leave. But here's the thing, if I brought these blocks in from the south across this blue border down here, I couldn't retreat that way. I'd have to retreat through a border that the enemy didn't come through. All right, so that's why pinning is important. That's why retreating units is important, because you can't build them back during the campaign. Alright, so movement then is a very important aspect of the game, and this is one of those deep strategical things that I don't usually do well as a solo player. But it's important because that's how you set up the battles. This is an important key concept because you're going to be able to bring in reserves. So you want to make sure you have plenty of soldiers spread around particular areas for either defending or attacking. Now, you would have to use your action points. You'd want to make sure you have a card with like 4 action points or 3 action points so you can appropriately activate everybody. So what we would do here, just like regular movement, is I would have to decide where I'm moving in soldiers from, and then be aware of my border limits by color. And then for the attacker, I'm going to declare which area I'm attacking from is my main area. So I probably wouldn't want to attack from here as my main area, because that would mean everything else comes in as reserves. So I might say, for example, Wilts will be my main area. So I would go ahead and move over here. Now, one thing though, when you're maybe want to set up your main attack, is you might want to, well, that's a border limit. Let's see, blue I think was 3. So I could go ahead and say move a couple folks down here for 1 action point. Then I could take this combined army as my main army and move them up here. Then later for another action point, I'd be able to bring in soldiers from Kent, and they would come in as reserve, and I usually place reserves face down so I know those are reserves. So this is my main attack force, here are the reserves. Now, because we alternate points, right, my defender here might see us getting ready for an attack, so he might want to move something down here to reinforce, and then I would move in my second unit. Or if I'm trying to get that element of surprise, I might say, well, these guys are going to come in as the main attackers. Now, everything else coming into this battle is reserve, even for the defender. So he might move somebody in from London for a movement point, action point. Then I would move in another set of blocks, reserves for an action point, and then he can move someone in as a reserve. And finally, I might move this guy in for a reserve. So this is a lot of planning ahead what you want to do without necessarily telegraphing your move. Now, this is important to decide who's the main attacker and then who the main defenders are, because the reinforcements, they don't participate in the first round of combat. They haven't arrived yet. They're marching to the field. These folks here from the main attack and the main defenders are already there. So once we have all the movement done, we can switch into combat. I'm going to rearrange the pieces a little bit so we can look at combat. Alright, so what I've done, I've just laid out a few blocks. This might not be, when we reveal everything, a realistic how things would have ended up. But the blocks are here just to demonstrate some of those combat principles. So here we have the 2 main attackers that came through, and then these were the main defenders. And then here are the reserves upside down. And then again, they're that way because they're not actually here until round 2. So what we would do then is the defender goes first. Now, one thing, there is a special rule for the bombards. Bombards on their first turn, they are attack. See, it says they are A3 for round 1. Well, they're the defender, so they're A3, and then later they're D3. So that very first turn, they're loaded, ready to shoot. So they would actually go first. They would be an A. Now these two units are also A, but the bombard, since it's defending, it goes first. So it's got 3 diamonds. That would be rolling 3 dice. And it hits on 3. So bombard, that's pretty devastating. So we would roll, and then I rolled here a 6-4-1. Now casualties come off immediately. You assign your points of damage to the highest step unit. In case of a tie, you get to pick. They're the same strength, the same initiative, so I'll go ahead and take off the Welsh unit, for example. We'll just pick that. Then the other A's would go, now the attacking A's. So he is strength of 3 with firepower of 2. So we would roll. Ooh, lucky, I got 2 hits. I rolled 2 ones. So I would look at the highest unit. This block has strength of 4, so it would take 1 casualty. Now again, there's a tie, so I would decide where it comes off. Now because the bombard's already fired, and then it would go in the subsequent turns as a D, I'm going to go ahead and take a point off of that since that's the slowest unit. Then I would go for the other attacking unit. It's now at 2 pips, so I'm going to roll 2 dice. Also has firepower 3, so we just roll 2 dice. It rolled a 5 and a 6, so it did terrible on its attack. Now you go to the Bs. There's 1 B defender. Since it took a point of damage, it's going to roll 3 dice, and it's firepower 3, so that's a very, very strong unit. I rolled a 5, 4, and a 3. So they would do 1 point of damage to the highest attacking unit, and they go like that. That's 1 round of combat. So combat's got 4 rounds. The attacker will attack for 3 rounds, and then it has to retreat on the 4th round. And then the defender gets to attack if it chooses all 4 rounds. You have the option to retreat. If things are going badly, you might want to pull units out, but you cannot retreat during turn 1. Also, during combat, if you retreat, you can't retreat through the borders that the enemy came across. So for our example, I actually had units from Kent and from Wilts who came in. So if York wanted to retreat, he could retreat either to Middlesex or through Dorset, and they'd have to observe the boundary limits as well. Now, if the attack, like during the movement, if the attacker and defender both brought in, say, reserves through Wilts, then player 2, usually the defender, could retreat out that side, not the attacker. So little things like that to keep in mind for when you're fighting and you need to retreat and whatnot. Okay, but let's say you're not retreating and you're just fighting. Well, now we would move on to the 2nd round of combat. Now at this time, because it's now round 2, I could reveal the units. Now I'm going to share one thing though, and it doesn't happen too often, but it can. If you bring an overwhelming force, let's say I brought all of these guys, and all of them had a chance to attack, and they actually killed all of these initial defenders, a couple things happen. One, you would immediately deploy the reserves. They're there to absorb any extra hits. Also, control of the zone changes, and so the attacker now becomes the defender, and the defender now becomes the attacker. Now, the reason why that's important and why that's kind of weird to kind of think about is basically that means the initiative has shifted towards the attacker, because remember, defenders attack first, so that means on the next combat rounds, the attacker is now the defender, and they now get to attack first. That also means that the people who were originally the defenders, since they're now the attacker, they would have to retreat during that 4th round of combat. So that's another reason why you really want to think about strategically how you move your troops and set them up to attack, because if you can make those devastating attacks, you can shift the whole flow of combat. But we'll take them away because we'll say that didn't happen. We'll put them back on reserve stats. So again, something that doesn't happen too often, but it could really affect combat. Well, now we're going to reveal the reserves, because we'll say it's now the 2nd round of combat. So I lay them out, and I bring in my reserves as well. So we'll just make 2 nice little piles here. Oop, did not flip him or her. All right. Well, now we got a little interesting. I've got one of my heirs. Ooh, one of the heirs came down. Ooh, and there's an enemy heir here as well. Wow, because there's a crown. Ooh, and look, we have a matching house shield as well. That's important for the defender. So even though there's a crown here, only the defender gets the benefit of the crown. And since we have a matching noble house, because he's a defender, he also gets +1 to his firepower because he's on a noble matching noble house. Now this isn't a matching shield for the noble, so for the heir, so he doesn't get a bonus for the shield and the crown. So he gets +1 firepower for the crown, and then this guy gets +1 firepower for a matching noble house shield. That's very good because the attacker has brought more firepower. Alright, so the same thing, we'd say this is round 2. We'll look for the defender for the A's. Well, there's the heir. He's going to add 1 to his firepower, but he's strength 3. So he now has a firepower of 4 though. Nice. So we roll some dice. Those are 3 hits. Firepower 4. Wow. Alright, so we would have to take a hit off the strongest unit first. That'd be this heir. I don't want my heir to die right away, so we'll take a point off of him, because they were tied. But now I got to take another point off of here. So that's 3 points gone. Now all of these remaining units are 2. We're going to take 1 off of, we'll just say this guy. Oh wait, that was only 3. For some reason I thought he took 4 points of damage. Okay, so whoa, that's lucky. That's all 3 points of damage dealt. Woof, okay. Then the other A defender I have is this guy here. And now he's defending his home, so he's going to roll 3 dice, and he has firepower 2. Alright, no hits. Alright, so lucky for the attacking Lancasters. Now, that's the defenders. Now the attackers go. So all the A attackers. Oh, we have 2 A attackers. They're each at 2 dice. And at 2. What I could do, I guess I could do this. The rules can't say I can't do it. We'll say 2 diamonds, 2 diamonds. That's all 4 dice. They're the same strength, not modified for anything, but they're all at 2. So I'll just roll all 4. That's 2 hits. So I'm going to apply to the strongest units first. We're going to apply to this guy first, because he is technically the weakest to all of them. Then to him, because he's the second weakest. There you go. That's 2 points of damage assigned. So that's all of the A's. Now we go to the B's. There are no B. Oh, there's a B unit right here for the defender. So he's going to roll 2 dice, and he hits on 3s. Oh, that's 2 more hits for the defender. Things are not going well for the attacker. So we'll take a hit here. We'll take a hit off of. He hasn't gone yet this turn, so we're going to take a hit off of one of the A's. Alright, so then we would look for my B attackers. I probably shouldn't reduce him because he's about to go. Oops. Alright, well that's 1 die for him. He rolled a 3, so that didn't work out. So I look at my B oh, that was all the B's. So now we do the C's. I have 1 C attacker, so he's going to roll 2 dice. Strength, firepower 2. Oh. And that's 2 hits. So I gotta look here at the defender. Highest always takes 1. So he's down. And then I look here. D hasn't fired yet. So I'm actually gonna take 1 off of him, because he's the weakest still. Now we do the D's. That was my only C, I think. Yeah, C2. Okay. So now the D. Now the bombard goes. Now the bombard has a strength of 3, and he rolls 2 dice. And he gets another hit. So we're going to eliminate, since I have a tie for the strongest, well, A's are going to go, so we'll take 1 off of here. Yeah, things really aren't looking well right now for the attacker. Alright, so that was round 2. We will look at round 3. Round 3 then is the last round that the attacker gets to do anything. Problem is, even if I retreat at this point, the defender still gets to attack. So that simulates them chasing down units and doing pursuit. Yeah, so it's not good. So the defender gets to go. So he looks for his A. Here's his A unit. It's only 2 dice, but they are strength 3. Oh, it's the crown. So he gets +1 for the crown. So he's actually 4. So 2 dice at 4. That's 1 more hit. We'll take that. We're saving the heir. Save the king. Any other A's for them? Yeah, that guy's an A. So he gets 1 die. He gets +1 firepower for his matching shield. So he's hitting on a 1 or 2, and he doesn't. You know, now I would have to decide as the attacker, since I have brought these guys down to attacking with like 1 or 2 dice or something like that, do I want to retreat? Because I'm only attacking with 1 die. That's not good. They have a lot of defensive bonuses. So I would say this was a botched assault. That's why the hidden fog of war aspects are so important with the blocks, because they're kind of face up. You really don't know what the opponent has until you get in there. But now I have an idea of what they have in there, and I'd have to rethink my strategy around that. We're going to go ahead and do some retreats then. So I would look for my A's. These are A's. Since we came in through, nobody came in through Dorset, so I could probably retreat 2 from there. Since it's a blue border, I could do up to 3. What is yellow is 4, blue is 3, red is 2. So we'll retreat. Run away so they don't attack. Then the B's go. So I have a B right here, and he's strength 2. But his firepower is 3, so he rolls 2 dice on 3s. So there's the drawback from retreating units. See, now I got to assign 2 hits to what's left. I want my king to live, so these 2 hits go to these nobles, and they're gone. Now, when you kill a noble, if it's a rose noble, so this rose symbol here, a couple things. One, they can't be turned, so they don't have that betrayal number, so they're always loyal. But when they die, they're gone permanently for that, they're gone. So a rose guy is gone. So I would actually take him out of play and then set him face down. Bummer. Now, if it was a regular noble, then I would take them out of play. I'd face them down, but they could actually come back on another campaign. Then my opponent, his matching noble, they would face down because you can't recruit them back, essentially, during that campaign. So the next campaign, that noble would be available then to recruit. But it does say that rose nobles are permanently eliminated. So we just lost one of my rose nobles. That's bad. So now that was all the, we're doing the B, defender B. Well, now the B gets to retreat. So since this is a blue border, I can have, what would I say, 3 units cross. We'll say he crossed because that's a friendly unit. So they're now gone out of Sussex except for my C. So all the B's are done. Then you check for the C's. Well, the C can retreat because there's no defending C's. But since we've already done 3 across that border, he's going to go back to Wilts. And then there's no more combat than for D. So they won. Now, if you're attacking in one, you could do like a regroup and you can move some units over. Also, there's rules for if you kill an heir. So the senior heir present in each battle, this is different. That's a charge. But there's also rules for like if you kill the heir. But one thing you do have is an heir charge. If I was attacking, say, with Henry here, the 6th, he could focus all of his attacks onto one block. For example, not a reserve, but like if you had a face-up block here. Because normally what happens is when you attack, so if I hit and did all 4 of my attacks, for example, with Henry, I scored 2 hits. That's great. Those hits then are usually spread around the blocks, right? You start with the highest strength block. But with an heir charge, what they can do is pick a block, attack that block specifically, and then all hits are applied to that one block. So in a general attack, you would spread your attacks. So he would reduce by 1, he would be reduced by 1. But when the heir charges, he applies all of his hits to a specific targeted block. So I could kill this block if I wanted to. Now, actually, I'd probably want to kill an heir, but then his charge would be done. The other thing, too, that's his attack. But let's say I rolled all 4 dice and I actually scored 4 hits, then that's the drawback, is the excess hits are lost. So the charge is really cool. It's a focus attack, but there's a chance that it might be overkill and you're wasting some hits. But there you go. That's actually, we'll say, the basics of combat, right? So again, you've got death of the heir, death of the nobles, possibly. You can regroup after an attack, but combat's really that simple. So again, the complexity of this game comes from your planning on your moving where areas to put your troops in so you can organize and coordinate your attacks and your defenses. That's where a lot of the strategy comes from. What units do you recruit? And then that's why retreat is so important, because you can't afford to lose a lot of your rose nobles. If you see things are going bad, even though you can fight for 4 turns, you might want to consider, I'm going to sacrifice a couple units so I can take out my important units. All right, so let's say then you've done your combat. One thing though that you could do before combat or during are the treachery rolls. So if you have like king, if you have the king player, the highest ranked heir who's on the king side, or the pretender, they can attempt a treachery roll. And I kind of mentioned that earlier, but just to kind of talk about that a little bit more, is who does that. Warwick, that's important because you've got some units that have this symbol here, Warwick. So if you have Warwick present, and you got house with a matching symbol, they get to do, an attempt to roll as well. All right, so with the treachery roll, then, for example, like with Warwick here. So if I had Warwick, here's Salisbury. He's got the shield. Basically, that's a loyalty of 2. So I would roll 2 dice, and again, if all the dice come up even, they defect. They didn't come up even, but if they came up even, what I would do is I would place Salisbury onto my side as reserve. And probably what I would want to do then is look through and find my equivalent Salisbury. Of course, I'd have to dig through my blocks. Now, the only thing is Warwick cannot take, it says he can't use this roll against Westmoreland or Northumberland, but like Salisbury, that seems to be fair game. All right, now the other thing too is you could potentially target a block up to like 3 times, because either A, you try to get it with like the king or with the pretender, or there's a treachery card you could play on somebody, or with Warwick. So if you really, really are trying to get folks to defect to your side for some reason, you could potentially do that. All right, so that's one last aspect of combat I wanted to share there. All right, so after combat's done, you've checked for treachery, you've got people pulled over or not, then you're going to move into the supply phase. All right, so the 4th phase of one of those turns, so you would have like the movement, you're recruiting, there'd be combat. So after all those things are done, then we check for supply, and essentially we're just looking to see if we are left with any areas that are overstacked. So essentially an area can hold comfortably 4 blocks. If you're overstacked, then you get to reduce one of those blocks by 1 step. Now, if you're in an area with a major town, like let's say up here London, that can support 5 blocks comfortably, so I wouldn't have to take a step loss for somebody. Then like the exile areas can hold up to 4 blocks plus their mercenary group. Also, Scotland, Ireland can support 2 blocks plus the mercenary group that they get. And let's see, that's pretty much it for that. So this is important too, because now as you're taking step losses, then after that, that's one reason why, again, strategy on how like you move things, and like if you're the attacker, you don't necessarily want to leave everything in an area. You want to regroup and move something out. Again, it's just to help prevent the overstacking and making sure that there's plenty of food and supplies in each area to keep the troops fighting. So there you go. After you've done the supply phase, then it's time to pop into the political turn. All right, now after all those 7 turns are played and all those 4 phases are played out for each of the 7 turns, that would be the end of that particular campaign. You would move then to the political turn. Now, on the political turn, a couple of important things happen. First of all, like let's say we were in London. The levies return to the pool, so they all go home. Bombards also would return home. Okay, and then if you have mercenary units, they go back to their home area. So they like I had the French, so French would go back to France. Those guys would go back. Then you would want to check for. Well, then it also says the rebel block. If you had the rebel block in play, that's the black block. So if the rebels were in play, they also would disband. Now, the reason why is you got to remember, even though this battle, the War of the Roses, took place over that 30-year period, it wasn't 30 years of constant warfare. So each campaign would last a couple of months, 3 months maybe. They would last a few months. And then there would be years between the next war. So all of these folks are going home. So they fought this campaign, they go home to lick their wounds, and then the map pretty much stays where you have your nobles. Now that's done, you want to check for usurpation. Usurpation, I guess what it's called. You're going to check to see who usurps the throne. So essentially, this is where the pretender gets to check to see if they become king for that period of time. So what they do is they look to see if they control the majority of nobles and heirs, and then each church block counts as one noble. So if they have the most of the majority then of the nobles, they become king, and then the person who was king now becomes the usurper. And that's important because, again, that's going to play for things like for initiative and whatnot. Also for checking for loss of heir and things of that nature. So that's important between each campaign. So once you've checked for and see if that changes. Also, if you do change, the person who was king, they go back to their exile area. All right, so basically they're starting their campaign over. Then, if there's no change, the pretender would go home, and his heirs, they go into exile. It says like the nobles' church on the map, they go to their own shield cathedral, unless it's enemy occupied. Then they have to go to the friendly pool. Then there's some special rules with that. Then the king goes home, similar thing. He goes to any crown area. It says return to their shield or any crown area. And then nobles and church on the map go to their own cathedral as well. So basically, this time period is where people are kind of resetting back to home areas. Now there's a campaign reset as well. It says all face down blocks in the pool. Like for example, if you eliminate a noble like we talked about, they would go back to your pool face down unless it's a rose noble. Rose nobles are permanently removed. But if it was a regular noble, like let's grab something like this where it had, not a rose, but, possible with a treachery number. If he died, he'd go back to your pool face down, but now he can now be face up because you could recruit him again later. Also, you get to move the rebel block to the pretender pool. See, that's important too because, again, if you swapped who is king and pretender, the pretender gets control of the rebels. And then all the blocks in the pool and on the map, everybody gets reset to full strength because, again, over a period of time, they replenish. That's why it's important you really consider your battles because units can't replenish during the campaign. It's in between the campaigns that things build back up. And then you're going to check for victory, which is the last thing. So basically it says if you eliminate all 5 enemy heirs, that's an instant victory. Otherwise, after the 3rd campaign, and you go through the usurpation step, whoever at that point is king, they win the game. Then there's some extra rules on Clarence and Exeter. So those are 2 heirs. Basically, they're subject to treachery rolls, can defect to the other side. They cannot defect if they are the king or pretender. All right, and then there's some rules if they defect. But again, that would go towards the end game to decide who ultimately is king. Now, kind of went over the political turn and victory kind of quick because the meat and potatoes of the game is understanding the map, how to move between your areas, setting up for your attack, and then ultimately attacking with your troops, right? That's where the main portion of the gameplay lies. And what's nice is, even though those rules are, in a way, fairly simple, I probably make things sound more complicated than they really are. Once you start playing, then things work out pretty good and it's like, okay, this all makes sense. But what do I do as a single player? So here's a tip that I have for solo play. I'm sure some of you have other tips for solo play, but the only real change that I make for solo play is in the cards and then deciding who gets initiative. So for example, what I'll do is after I shuffle the cards to start my campaign, I'm going to deal out my 7 piles. So I'm going to say, like, here's the Lancaster pile, here's the York pile. So 3 cards, 4 cards, 5 cards, 6 cards, 7 cards. Then I just check to make sure that there's not a mulligan situation. So that's 6 points, 9 points, 13 points, 15, 16. So technically that's not a mulligan hand. Then I'll do the same here. 7, 9, 12, 14, 18, 20. So quite a bit of an advantage on this side, but not a mulligan either. And then I'll just kind of mix these up just a little bit and do the same thing over here. Mix it up just a little bit. And what I would do is I'd say, okay, I just take the top card or just draw one randomly, and I'll say, for this particular turn of the campaign, Lancaster plays the 3 and York plays the 2. Okay, great. Oh, you can't see the 2. So that's how I would play. So I would go ahead and say that the king won, so he's going to be player 1, and then I would start the hand that way. And then I do the same thing as we progress to the next turn. So I'd say, oh, the king this time decided to play the muster, so he wins initiative. He just doesn't get to move any additional troops. But it says designate one friendly or vacant area. Any and all friendly blocks can move normally to the muster area. See, movement is not allowed. Oh, that's good, because maybe I want to set up for a big attack. But then this guy would get to move three areas in return. Anyway, you just kind of play through there. Oh, okay, now this time he played a 3, but maybe York decided that he needs the initiative, so he's going to do a lot of stuff. Anyway, I do that simply because I could lay both hands out, but since I'm kind of, playing for both sides, I don't want to be unfair. So if I just randomly pick a card each turn for each person, then hopefully that makes it a little kind of fair between the two sides. But that's kind of the basics of the game. I hope that answers questions that you may have. Again, if you're a veteran player, you probably know this game very well and understand the importance of strategy and moving your units to match their symbol with their home shields and moving your heirs to the different areas for the crown. Same thing, just to bolster their defense. Maybe you're really good at knowing who to roll against as far as who to try and get them to defect at the start of a battle. So there's a lot of depth. So again, the complexity of the rules just really help to streamline the fact that the game focuses on the strategy. Well, anyway, if you have questions, go ahead, leave that in the comments. Just share maybe what your thoughts are on the game. I think this is a really good game for, again, kind of an introductory, because it's not overly complicated, but it gives you a lot of thought as far as what do I want to do. It's definitely one of those games that the more you play, the more you start to understand the strategy and the importance of movement. But as far as the basic mechanics, I think a new player could pick this up very easily. Just keep the rule book handy. And that's another thing too. So if I was going to call this the review portion, I would say that every question I've had has been answered in the rule book. And I went to Board Game Geek and saw some of the questions people had, but in reality those questions are all answered here as well. So I would say the only thing that kind of stuck for me a little bit was with the battle reserves and when you would do the change of control. And so I still might not have that exactly 100% correct, but it's what made sense to me. And I didn't really see a good explanation on Board Game Geek, but again, if I just spent time reading the rules and kind of play it out where if the defender loses those first defending blocks, even though he has reserves, those reserves, since they don't really come into being until the second round, that's when the control would change. So when those original defenders die, that's when you change control. That's the only thing that maybe I'm kind of hung up on a little bit. But otherwise, everything else is just explained out really clear. I think you can pick this up, play it relatively quickly. the rules are laid out in such a way that if you just kind of follow through the sequence of play, you don't have to spend a lot of time studying the rules. Just maybe read through once and then just lay the blocks out and start playing. Also, again, if you want to call this part of the review, you know, the blocks and the artwork, I think, are also really good. This is very, very thematic. I mean, when I'm playing this and going through and I'm using the name, you know, Salisbury, Kent, and there's, you know, London and all these places, it's like they're very, very familiar to me. And so it's kind of easy to jump in and imagine that, yeah, okay, we've got these names and places that I'm familiar with, and we're fighting these battles. So I think it just all does a good job of pulling me into that time period. Now, if I'm going to complain about something, because I want this, you know, if you're going to do a review, you should also point out things that are maybe difficult. I'd say just the one, I would have liked a better example of how to switch the control during battle of the controlling player for an area, just to make sure I'm doing it right. Also, if I was going to pick on a component, and again, this is just picking, because I think overall the game is very solid. So just, I would love to see a mounted map. Even if they had to sell it separately, I think that'd be great. I know for a lot of folks, this actually map holds up just fine, and I'm going to get a lot of use out of it. Or if I needed to, I could stick it under Plexi, and then we'd be fine that way as well. But if they had like a special collector edition where you could get like a nice hard-mounted map, I think that would be very cool. Like I said, that's probably about the only real finicky thing I can think of. Maybe if I really wanted to nitpick, I'd say make the cards more of a playing card size. That way it fits inside my sleeve protector a little bit better. But now we're talking really nitpicky, you know. Really finding fault with this game is difficult for me to do, because I think it's put together that well. Alright, but again, if you have some thoughts or comments on that, please don't hesitate to share. And thank you so much for watching. I know this is kind of long and I'm kind of rambly at the end, but I do highly recommend this game for, you know, anybody who's interested. Alright, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.